Welcome back, everyone, to A Foggy Day on Olympus and to our brand new series on the 20th century Balkans. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name's Mike Pierce. Yes, we've subtitled it A Tragedy in 5 Acts.
Does that mean that everything that happens in it is bad?
Not completely, but it certainly was a very turbulent century, not just in the Balkans, of course, but certainly there.
Right. Yes, and we're defining Balkans in our own way as the territories of what was, for much of the time, Yugoslavia.
Yes, that's not strictly correct geography, but if we cover the whole peninsula, we'd need a much longer series. And I think it's going to become evident, even in this episode, how much we're trying to cram into our hour or so. Yes.
Right. Now, I know we often say this is a place for grown up discussions aimed at grown up people, but the implied finger wagging is going to be a little more serious today, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you came here to get your opinions confirmed, you're in the wrong place. But seriously, passions over this subject run extremely high, and there's almost nothing one can say that won't make somebody mad. So let's say this clearly at the outset, and I'll say something similar for every episode in this series, I think. If you are watching to have the heroism of your ethnic group or country confirmed, or to have your Yugo nostalgia and the stories about the partisans they told you in Mali Pionieri backed up, or you're already mad because outsiders are daring to say anything at all about any of this, well, you just sit there and get mad. We are not looking to vindicate anything, but seeking to understand what happened and why.
So, it might be a foggy day up here, but an Olympian judgment is still what we're aiming at.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Well, can we move on now?
Sure.
So, in 1900, the use of the term Balkans to refer to anything but a particular range of mountains was still fairly recent, but it had already acquired certain connotations by this time.
Yes, it had. And a lot of that reputation was actually cliché, but the cliché meant that Balkans was already a byword for impossibly tangled, furious politics, insoluble problems, passionate, mutually exclusive nationalisms, and fissiparousness. In fact, even today, the term balkanization means something being cut up into ever smaller pieces.
So, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the whole of southeastern Europe was dominated by two multi ethnic empires.
Yes, and that, of course, is the Habsburg Austrian Empire, we can see there, and the Ottoman Empire. The former had pushed the latter back, starting from the late 17th century and on into the 18th. The only exception to what we just said there is, as the more eagle-eyed of our viewers will observe, an even smaller version of Montenegro, which was at least arguably independent. It didn't have much international recognition. But other than that, yes, those two entities dominated the whole peninsula. But during the course of the 19th century, Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria had become independent of Ottoman rule, and Bosnia had been taken under Habsburg administration. And these changes had all happened as the result of the rise of modern Western-style nationalism, local banditry and uprisings, and unruly behavior by local, nominally Ottoman elites. Now, these are all highly complex stories in themselves, which we're not going to look at here. We're simply going to note by bringing this map up that by the end of the 19th century, these changes had happened. In respect of Bosnia, I'd certainly want to recommend, and here comes the first of our book plugs for this week, Robin Oakey's book, Taming Balkan Nationalism, the Habsburg Civilizing Mission, in quotation marks, in Bosnia, 1878 to 1914. And that was a mission which ended so disastrously with the outbreak of World War One. But going into that at least gives one the flavour of the kind of turmoil that was arising in Bosnia and was not untypical of the region as a whole. Further on this, for more on Balkan nationalism, I'd recommend people see my article by entering Substack and national identity and religion in Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia into your favorite search engine, or you could click on the link in the notes.
Yes, and we're referring people to this because there's a whole load of back history to all of this that we just really don't have the time to go into here, right?
Right. It's a really, really interesting story, but we're compressing, as will already be apparent to people by the end of today's episode, an awful lot of material in here. So we're going to try and keep ourselves strictly to the 20th century.
Especially since the subject is pretty much your specialty, or one of them anyway.
Well, yeah, immersion into the region over 30 years and reading Balkan history until it was almost literally coming out of my ears. Yes.
So, this next chart is the real starting line for today's episode, how things looked in 1900.
Right. This is our go button, if you like. So the territories that would later form Yugoslavia, as they were in 1900. So Austria-Hungary held Slovenia, Croatia, Vojvodina, which was then part of southern Hungary within the empire. It's now northern Serbia. Bosnia, which it had held de facto since 1878, and then de jure from 1908. And an area that probably most of our viewers can't find on the map, but Balkan viewers will know, the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. They held in the same way as Bosnia until 1908, when it reverted for at least a few years to Ottoman control before they lost it. Serbia, south of the Danube, was an independent kingdom, the Kingdom of Serbia. Montenegro in 1900 was an independent principality which declared itself to be a kingdom from 1910. So its prince upgraded himself to king. And the Ottoman Empire held Kosovo and North Macedonia. In fact, they held all of geographic Macedonia, but this chart is just talking about the territories that would later on be Yugoslavia. Okay, well, we need to look at something that happens right near the beginning of the 20th century, which was a fateful change in Serbia. And that brings us to this man, Alexander I Obrenović, and his wife, Draga Mašin. He had been king since 1889, but on the 11th of June, he and his wife were ferociously assassinated. During the course of the 19th century, the throne of Serbia had been hotly contested between two families, the Karađorđević family and the Obrenović family. And in 1903, it changed hands for the final time when these two were assassinated.
Yes, I remember when we walked past his palace in Belgrade and we actually saw the balcony where their bodies were tossed down from.
Right, they were in their bedroom at night and assassins broke in and yes. And this is the man who took over. He is the champion of the rival family, the Karađorđević family. So he's he's more than 30 years older than the king he's just had assassinated. So he becomes king from that point. And the reason this is so fateful is because of the big change in Serbia's foreign policy. His predecessor had pursued friendship with Vienna, which had a lot to be said in favor of it because that was Serbia's main trading partner, particularly in terms of the pig trade. All those sausages being used in Vienna, a lot of the meat came from Serbia. Whereas the new king Petar, with an eye to expanding Serbia to the north and west, that is, wanting to grab Habsburg territory, at least in the long term, he courted St. Petersburg, the Russian capital. And this was a move with ominous implications for the future.
Yeah, and the change in foreign policy was probably popular with most of the Serbs, right? But it did prepare the way for World War One.
Yes, it did. It oriented Serbia decisively towards its Slavic and Orthodox big brother, which had long been there in the background generally, if we look at some of the goings on in the 19th century, which we can't do now, but it made it much more explicit. And given the state of Russian Habsburg rivalry, it made it quite plain whose side Serbia was on. And it did serve to forward Serbia's ambitions for some of those Habsburg held territories. Well, we can't mention this coup without mentioning this man, Dragutin Dmitrievich, better known simply as Apis. And he is, in a sense, King Petar's evil genius, to dabble in cliches for a moment. He was the organizer of the coup, and he was chief of military intelligence. And about 8 years later, in 1911, he's the main founder of the Black Hand, a secret paramilitary organization aiming to bring about a large South Slav state, centered, of course, upon Serbia.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about the Black Hand near the end of this episode.
Yes, we are. Some of our viewers will already be aware of this name and its links with the famous or notorious assassination in Sarajevo in 1914. But patience, we'll get there in a little bit. But staying with Serbia and the Bosnian angle for a moment, in 1908, the Habsburgs finally decided to do away with the fiction that they were just running Bosnia on behalf of the Ottomans, and they formally annexed it. And there was nothing really the Ottomans could do about that. By this point, the Ottoman Empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. It was gravely weakened, way past the strength of its heyday 300 years before. But it was people in Serbia who got really angry. And we can see demonstrations here in Belgrade against this annexation just over the border from themselves.
Okay, remind us why Serbs would be mad about this. After all, Bosnia had been run by the Habsburgs for 30 years already, and it's not like any Serbs would have wanted the Ottomans back in charge there.
Right, it's down to feelings of Serb nationalism and the sense that the population of Bosnia, or the large bulk thereof, and definitions are highly contentious, we'll leave that aside for a moment, that they were Serbs and that therefore their rightful place was as part of a Serb state. While Bosnia's status had been, perhaps a little bit absurd or a sort of legal fiction, then Serb nationalists might have hoped that at some point it would fall into their hands. But if the Habsburgs are going to formally take it over, that hope appears to have been taken away. And so Serb nationalist opinion, which would have been particularly strong in Belgrade, pre-World War I nationalism was especially an urban and middle class phenomenon, would have led to these kind of demonstrations. Demonstrations with which the government in Serbia would have been entirely happy, by the way. They wanted this kind of show and force to demonstrate to the Habsburgs how mad their population was.
Right.
Okay, well, we're going to move a little further south from Serbia and Bosnia now to look at Ottoman Macedonia, which is in the early 20th century coming to boiling point. Now, terminology remains an extremely prickly subject to this day, and what we're going to say in the next few minutes is going to please almost nobody. Now, what we've got here is geographic or historic Macedonia in blue superimposed upon modern borders or white lines. And lots of people, especially diplomats, referred to the Macedonian question. It was a byword for insolubility among European diplomats of the decades before 1912. The Ottoman Empire was clearly gravely weak. It was almost certainly going to lose most of its possessions at some point. Almost the only thing propping it up was the extreme contentiousness about who would get what, and the major powers were afraid of one another, but so were the local Balkan states. Who was going to get Macedonia? And the trouble with the situation in Macedonia is that the extreme mixture of its population, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, culturally, made a nonsense of the logic of nationalism, whilst simultaneously exciting mutually exclusive nationalist passions. Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Turkish, because there were plenty of Turks living in the region and even more Muslims generally, although in the parlance of the time, most local Muslims were simply designated as Turks, even if that wasn't their language. But the region also contained large numbers of Vlachs, Jews, Albanians, and Roma.
So there was never any possibility of drawing new national borders that contained just one ethnic group.
No, there wasn't, because nobody was in a majority in anything except the most local of areas. You simply couldn't draw lines that would have all of one group on one side and all of another or the various others on other sides.
Right.
It would have been just a complete nonsense. And also, and this is going to make us even more unpopular with almost everybody, there were still loads of people who couldn't have told you what their ethnicity was because that wasn't the way they thought about themselves.
Right. Right. Oh, and you better explain Vlachs.
Okay, Vlachs. It's tempting to go into an explanation here of where this term comes from, but I'm going to forego that. Let us just say, for the sake of simplicity, that they were people speaking a Latin derived language very similar to Romanian. And sometimes they're called Aromanians as well. Their numbers are greatly diminished nowadays. A lot of them have been assimilated, particularly into surrounding Slavic populations. But there are still some in North Macedonia and Greece. I'm less well informed about continuing populations in other neighbouring states. Well, as an illustration of the contentious point I made a moment ago, let's come to this guy, H.N. Brailsford, who was a Brit travelling through and studying the area in 1905. And he is in the area of Lake Ohrid, which he refers to as Ohrida, which is more like the Albanian name for the lake. I questioned some boys from a remote mountain village near Ohrida, which had neither teacher nor resident priest, and where not a single inhabitant was able to read, in order to discover what amount of traditional knowledge they possessed. I took them up to the ruins of the Bulgarian Tsar's fortress. Now, this is Tsar Samuel from the early to central Middle Ages, and that fortress is in the town of Ohrid. I should hasten to add that locals today will want to insist that Tsar Samuel was the Macedonian Tsar, but that just illustrates the impossibility of agreeing on terminology. So the fortress dominates the lake and the plain from the summit of an abrupt and curiously rounded hill. Who built this place? I asked them. The answer was significant. The freemen. And who were they? Our grandfathers. Well, they mean, of course, their distant grandfathers of some 900 years before. Yes, but were they Serbs or Bulgarians or Greeks or Turks? They weren't Turks, they were Christians, which is undoubtedly true because the Turks hadn't come to the area until the 14th century. And this seemed to be the extent of their knowledge.
So Brailsford's point is that these people had a religious identification, not a national one.
Right. And although passionate nationalists from the region will be able to point to people from this time period who did identify in those terms, there are, let's put the point gently, at least as many who did not think like this. This is painfully evident, particularly amongst, let us call them Slavic speakers, who well into the 20th century referred to their own speech simply as nashki, our language, right, rather than giving it some national name. Okay, well, let's look at this organization, VMRO, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, which had been founded in 1893 in Salonika or Thessaloniki, whichever locution pacifies your particular passions. And an incredibly ethnically mixed city as it had been for many, many centuries. Actually, since the late Middle Ages until the Holocaust, the largest single ethnic group there were Sephardic Jews. But there were Slavs, there were Albanians, there were Greeks, there were Vlachs, of course, and others. So the organization was aimed at autonomy for Macedonia within the Ottoman Empire.
So not actual independence then.
No, and this was true of a number of other movements, even in the early 20th century. So, right down to 1911, 1912, a lot of Albanian leaders wanted autonomy, not independence, for a variety of reasons. Either they thought that it would be unfeasible, or they themselves were painfully aware of how mixed the population was, or they feared being absorbed by surrounding states and didn't want to be, this kind of thing. Now, although VMRO was supported principally by Christian Slavs, it feared being seen as a tool of Bulgarian expansionism, partly for its own sake, but mostly because if it was viewed that way, that would attract the opposition of the great powers who didn't want an overmighty new state in the Balkans, whether Bulgaria or anything else. So they saw Macedonia as indivisible, so including all the areas in blue we saw a few moments ago, with all inhabitants being Macedonians.
So not primarily ethnic either then, just regional.
Yes, although that would quickly change quite sharply. Actually, within a pretty short time, they would come to be seen as the arm of the, well, people who were often identified as Bulgarians in the region. Yeah, let's just leave it at that. All right, well, here are their operating principles. The revolutionary organization should be established within Macedonia and should act there so that the Greeks and Serbs couldn't label it as a tool of the Bulgarian government. and its founders should be locals and living in Macedonia. The political motto of the organization should be the autonomy, there's the word again, of Macedonia. The organization should be secret and independent without any links with the government of liberated, i.e., no longer Ottoman, neighbor states. And finally, from the Macedonian diaspora in Bulgaria and from the wider Bulgarian society, only moral and material help for the struggle of the Macedonian revolutionaries should be required, i.e., not actual recruits. Now, for more on this organization, a fairly recent book by Keith Brown, Loyal Unto Death, analyzes the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization and the 20,000 members or so who at some point made up its ranks in the decade up to 1903. All right, we can't go much further without mentioning this famous episode around this lady here, Ellen Maria Stone, a doughty spinster if ever there was one, and a Congregationalist missionary from New Hampshire. And she was captured along with a Bulgarian convert by VMRO bandits in September 1901. And after a ransom demand of 25,000 Turkish lira, which was around $110,000, she and her companion were eventually released in February 1902. So that is 5 months later, for just a little more than half that amount.
Okay, so what's an American Congregationalist missionary doing in late Ottoman Macedonia? And why would the Muslim Turks allow Western missionaries at all?
Both very good questions. Well, remember that the Ottoman Empire is politically and economically extremely weak. And the Western powers had got used to bullying it and squeezing things out of it for a while. Most of them could have blown it away without too much effort. But it suited their purposes not to, partly because they were a little afraid of one another, particularly because they were afraid of Russia. And also they didn't want, as I mentioned a moment ago, overmighty Balkan states expanding too drastically. But it meant that in the religious sphere, the Turks felt compelled to concede what they would never have conceded earlier, which is outside interference. So American missionaries got in there, although they were not allowed to evangelize Muslims. They were only allowed to evangelize among existing Christians of other churches, overwhelmingly, of course, the Orthodox Church. Well, this whole saga is recorded in Teresa Carpenter's fairly recent book, The Miss Stone Affair, America's first modern hostage crisis. It's not a very large book, and it's kind of fun, and it takes us into that world. So this is the kind of stuff that's happening somewhere between revolutionism and politics challenging the integrity and the authority of the Ottoman government, and traditional banditry, people being captured for ransom. As it happened, Miss Stone had a lot of sympathy for her captors and their political objectives. Well, the following year after her release, so in 1903, is the famous Ilinden Uprising, which is greatly celebrated in North Macedonia to this day. And it's called Ilinden. It's named after the prophet Elijah's day, August the 2nd, which was when the whole thing started off. Mostly it was supported by Slav peasants and some Vlachs. And they set up provisional government in Kruševo. But 10 days later, Kruševo was recaptured and destroyed by the Turks. And by the end of the September, the uprising was over. The Ottomans took savage reprisals. They burned down 200 villages, several thousand people were killed, and 30,000 Orthodox Slavs fled over the frontier into Bulgaria, which in itself illustrates which kind of ethnicity and religious confession had been the principal supporter of the uprising.
Despite their
Well,
attempts to make it seem like they weren't connected.
right, but that is starting to change quite fast. The politics of Greeks and Bulgarians in this region for the last decade or so of the 19th century and the first of the 20th is so complex that we don't have time to go into that now. But it was pretty vicious, and a lot of it was centered around things like ecclesiastical control. Do try and remember that for hundreds of years, the Orthodox Church had been referred to by people in the region, but also particularly by outsiders, simply as the Greek Church. And so, in an era of modern nationalism, that allowed lots of Greek nationalists to claim that if people in a region are part of the Greek church, well, they must be Greeks. We simply have to teach them to speak Greek
Right.
and to identify as Greeks. Right?
Yeah.
But we can't go any further into all of that here, I'm afraid. Well, we have a few pictures. There's so many pictures we could have shown, and I've been hyper selective just to cut this down to some kind of manageable size today, not just on this topic, but the others that we'll be touching upon. So this shows the Cheta of General Ivan Tsonchev during the Ilinden uprising of 1903. And a Cheta simply means a guerrilla band. And here is the Cheta of Pitu Guli, who was a Vlach and a Vumero revolutionary who was born in Kruševo, and he was killed there in 1903. As it happens, I know one of his, well, he didn't actually have any descendants, but a distant relative who would now count as his, I don't know, great, great, great nephew or something like that, does not live in Kruševo. But yes, and there's a statue to him in Skopje. We should mention this fellow as well, Godse Delchev. He was born in what Slavs called Kukush, now Kilkis in Greece. He attended the Bulgarian men's high school in Thessaloniki. And remember that overwhelmingly Orthodox Slavs in geographic Macedonia were referred to as Bulgarians. And then went to the military school in Sofia, which is in the state of Bulgaria. And he was a Vumero leader influenced by Marxism and anarchism, and helped organize support among Bulgarian army officers, which, remember, this is something that Vumero is not really supposed to do. He ended up being killed by Ottoman police after his Cheta were betrayed by villagers, a fact which tells us what a lot of ordinary people thought about these revolutionaries, by the way.
Yeah.
While he was preparing the Ilinden uprising, which broke out 3 months after his death. And his tomb is here in Sveti Spas Church in Skopje. Ugly tomb, beautiful church. And whilst we're on this topic, we should mention this man as well, Yanis Sandanski. There's schools named after him in North Macedonia today, as there are about the others. He was on the extreme left of Vumero, and he was involved in the capture and the ransom of Miss Stone. But he was also involved in assassinating leaders of rival Vumero factions.
So these guys were killing one another in faction fights.
Yeah, it was really vicious sort of setup. A state of affairs that would get even worse actually after World War One in the interwar period when Vumero continued to exist and act in this sort of fashion. It's a bit like what we saw during the Northern Ireland troubles with the IRA and the INLA. I mean, if you were a member of those groups, you were pretty much as likely to be killed by your own fellow terrorists as you were by the British Armed Forces. Yeah. It was pretty grim. And after 1908, he supported the Young Turks, which was a nationalist Turk movement which overthrew the traditional government of the Ottoman Empire and took control of what remained of the empire for its last decade or so. He actually supported them in wanting a non-national Balkan Socialist Federation. Perhaps somewhat in contradiction, or at least in tension with this, he supported the Bulgarian army in the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13, which we'll get to in a few moments. Well, although it doesn't really belong to this subject, we can't not mention Montenegro, that tiny little state in its mountain fastness, which had been at least arguably independent of Ottoman control all through the long centuries. And this shows us here King Nicola I. I'm afraid it always makes me laugh to say that because Montenegro doesn't become a kingdom till 1910, and there was no Nicola II or any other king of Montenegro who's the first and the last one. And here he is with his wife, sons, daughters, and so on, all of them, in 1910. So he'd been prince since 1860, when he was just 19 years old. Montenegro had finally been recognized internationally as independent in 1878, which was the year a lot of things changed in the Balkans. And as we said, in 1910, he upgrades himself from prince to king.
So this political unrest in Serbia and the revolutionaries here in Macedonia, these are just examples of what's happening in the Balkans prior to the Balkan Wars, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Right. And the outside world was well aware of the incredible complexity of all of these issues and the ways in which the revolutionaries, their aims were mutually exclusive, and that to give ground to any of them would be to infuriate and enrage the others.
Right.
And that led the great powers, at least tacitly, to continue to uphold the status quo and this now increasingly rickety Ottoman Empire, even though they knew that couldn't really last. Well, the hammer blow comes in 1912 to 13 when there are two Balkan Wars.
Yeah, so we're talking about two wars in the space of a year.
Yeah, the first one lasted nearly 8 months, from October 1912 to May 1913, and the second one lasted 6 weeks in the summer of 1913. They almost really kind of flow into one another. Now, the prelude to this is a successful Albanian revolt against the Ottomans from January to August 1912. And it had gained major concessions in terms of autonomy and the use of the Albanian language. Now, illiteracy in Albania was almost universal, and it's only right at the beginning of the 20th century that there is an agreed format for writing the language down. And big differences, as there were with all of the European languages, between the various dialects, some of which were mutually unintelligible and so on. The major division amongst the Albanians was and remains between the Gegs, that is, the people in the north of the country, so say from Tirana northwards and into Kosovo and so on, and the Tosks from Tirana southwards and into the easternmost part of what's now North Macedonia and Epirus in northwestern Greece. So these people didn't necessarily have a lot in common, but what they were worried about was that the Ottoman Empire would disintegrate and that they would be gobbled up by these new Balkan states. And so, in a way to preempt that, to enhance their status within the empire, this revolt happened, and it was successful. But Serbia and its allies had other plans for these territories, and so that prompted them then quickly to intervene. So we should mention this lady here, Edith Durham. She is the acknowledged premier chronicler of Albania in the early 20th century, though not in the book we're waving at you here, but through her most famous work, High Albania. In this collection of essays, she ranges more widely, not just Albania, but Montenegro, Serbia, and the Ottoman vilayets of Kosovo and Monastir. And for more on this and my take on this book and her essays and on her, have a look at my article by entering Substack again and Edith Durham, The Blaze in the Balkans, Selected Writings 1903 to 41 into whatever is your favorite search engine. Crazy, I know. I think it will have become apparent already to all of our viewers that what we're doing is inserting these things here just to short circuit a load of very important subtopics that we simply can't squeeze into this properly. We just kind of ding the topic and move on.
Right.
Okay, so the aim of the First Balkan War of 1912 was to drive the Ottomans out of Europe completely and to divide those territories amongst the victor powers, that is, the other Balkan states. And in that, at least, the Balkan allies succeeded almost completely.
So the only thing that the Ottomans had left in Europe was that little purple area of Thrace that is still Turkey today.
Yes, that basically was it. And we have a propaganda postcard here produced in Bulgaria showing the flags and the monarchs of Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro shown together.
So these are all the recently independent states minus Romania.
Yeah, minus Romania, because Romania, as you can see from the map, didn't really have a common border with any of the areas still under Ottoman control. So it had nothing to gain. So it's the other four who are doing this. And we've got a similar kind of propaganda postcard here, but this one produced in Greece, showing Balkan cooperation.
Yeah, and the serpent or dragon or whatever it is meant to be the Turks.
Yep, that's what it is. So there is, in a way, a kind of religious element to this. Orthodox states against the Muslim Turks. Yes. Well, quick picture show. Here are Ottoman soldiers on review in Skopje. And here, just so we can see what some of these Ottoman soldiers will have looked like. And here we have Macedonian volunteers, so irregulars, fighting for Bulgaria.
So the Orthodox Slavs of Macedonia, did they consider themselves to be Bulgarians?
You know, we could be lynched even for asking this question, let alone for answering it honestly. But mostly the answer is, insofar as they identified themselves in national terms at all, then mostly yes. And certainly foreigners identified them that way. And it was a tendency that Bulgaria was anxious to encourage. And here are captured Turkish weapons in Skopje in October. And this shows a Serbian sentry in conversation with a captured Turkish officer at the entrance to the Kale, which is the massive fortress in Skopje in the same month. And here are Skopje dignitaries, leaders of different religious confessions and so on, going to meet the victorious King Petar I of Serbia that month. Here's some advice to all of our viewers. If you ever live in a country that is invaded by the soldiers of another country, my advice to you is to turn out and clap and cheer the advancing troops treated as if you thought this were a liberation. It greatly adds to your chances of survival. And if you are some kind of a local civic leader, then it will help you at least to cooperate with the new authorities.
Aren't you glad you listened to this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. They're very, very practical advice, I'm telling you. Okay, well, Serbian forces carried out massacres of Albanians in a number of places, especially in Skopje. And here is a report from the Frankfurter Zeitung of 14th March 1913. Our correspondent in Skup, that is Skopje, brought us the shocking news that 300 Albanians have been shot by the Serbs, once again without trial. The report will, of course, be denied, as have all of the proven crimes and atrocities committed by the military leadership. At the beginning of the war, the Serbian authorities told us quite openly, we are going to exterminate the Albanians. We feel it's our duty to expose the intentions of the leadership in Belgrade. Systematic extermination is carried out unabated despite all European protests. The gentlemen will deny everything. The facts speak louder than any open admission of guilt ever could. Since Serbian troops crossed the border last autumn and occupied territory inhabited by the Albanians, there has been one bloodbath after the other.
So, this is pretty terrible. Why would they do this?
Well, this, of course, would be a pattern through much of the 20th century, although, of course, it's got plenty of precedents in past centuries as well. The Albanians had not generally been considered to be a people group or an ethnos at all. They were some way behind in the process of people identifying in national terms. And certainly the leadership in the governments of the Balkan allies was anxious that the Albanians shouldn't do so because they all had designs upon territory inhabited by Albanians. The Serbian government was particularly at fault here. In their view, North Albania should be part of Serbia. After all, it had been part of old Serbia under the empire of Stefan Dusan in the 14th century. And the modern Serbian state wanted to claim that it was simply the modern version of that Serbian kingdom. They particularly wanted an outlet to the sea. Serbia is, of course, landlocked, and they didn't want to be landlocked. And so they claimed that the very mountainous lands of northern Albania, going down to the coast, should be theirs on the basis of the 14th century kingdom, that it was, in fact, old Serbia. But any kind of coming together of any Albanian identity, whether that's autonomy within the Ottoman Empire or even worse, Albanian independence, would make that plan impossible. And so what do? You make sure that the territories you're moving into can be Serbianized, and anybody who's resisting that is liable to be massacred. So I'm afraid that's what happens. Now, we should say something here about Kosovo and the Serbian religio-national myth. Kosovo had long been the key target of Serbian nationalist aspirations. The reasons are complex and relate to the mythology around the Battle of Kosovo Polje back in 1389, which we can't explain here, but maybe enter that into a search engine, you'll see what that was about. As I used to love to say to students, the Battle of Kosovo Polje is way more important today than it was in 1389. But the myth insists that this was a heroic defeat at the hands of the Ottomans. For nationalists, an independent Serbia could not be complete until the defeat had been avenged and had been conquered for Serbia, which in 1912 it is. The fact that during the intervening 5 centuries, Kosovo had acquired an Albanian ethnic majority was a complicating factor.
Yeah, no small point there. Now, this is such a big topic and a hotly controversial one, and we're really going to have to do a whole episode on it at some future point.
Yes, we are. I mean, we're going to come back to the further tortures inflicted on this region during the course of the 20th century, right down to its bitter end, actually. But even that won't deal with the arguments about what happened in the late Middle Ages or in the late 17th century and so on. So, at some point in the future, with a series yet to be cooked up in our heads, we will deal with this. But for now, we're simply going to have to say, here's a huge topic, and we can't pursue it any further. But here is an amazing painting by Pa Jovanovic, one of my favorite painters, actually, Avenging Kosovo. And yes, he really did live to be 98 years old.
I would have thought that you'd hate this kind of painting.
Yes, because it's propounding this sort of national myth and a romantic nationalism. And on that point, you would be right. But I simply admire it as a work of art. I don't need to endorse what the piece of art is saying to be able to say, wow, that is an amazing painting. But I'm afraid a lot of his paintings are at least somewhat like this, and they are absolutely fantastic. He does a superb job. Yeah, as I say, he is one of my very favorite painters, even though I'm not necessarily endorsing his message. Yeah. Well, here are Albanian captives being paraded through Belgrade in the aftermath of this fighting. Here we have Serbian soldiers at the Battle of Prilep in Macedonia that year, and a cholera outbreak behind Turkish lines.
Yes, as had been typical for many centuries, equally as many people died from the spread of disease as from actual battle.
Yes, yes, notoriously true in many conflicts like the Crimean War back in the 1850s, for example. It was starting to become less true, partly down to the changing nature of war, partly down to improvements in medical provision for soldiers, but still, it was a big factor in the Balkan Wars. Yeah. Here we've got Albanians who are largely Muslim and less resentful of the Ottomans preparing to fight Serbs in 1912.
Now, why were most Albanians less resentful of the Ottomans? I mean, after all, not all Albanians were Muslim.
No, historically, the Gegs in the north had been Catholic, the Tosks in the south, Orthodox, but both of those groups had been reduced to relatively small minorities, not tiny, but still small, because during the Ottoman centuries, particularly large numbers of Albanian speakers had been Islamized. Although it has to be said that in all three categories, Catholic, Muslim, and Orthodox, religion sat, let us say, pretty lightly upon people. And traditional practices, this is especially true in the north and in Kosovo, weighed far more than more orthodox forms of religious devotion, let's say like that and folk religion. But things were changing fast under the pressure of events. As we've said, a lot of Albanian speakers were fairly comfortable under Ottoman rule. They were used to it, it had been there for hundreds of years. They didn't like the idea of being taken over by aggressive and perhaps homogenizing Slavic or Greek Orthodox states. And this tends to be true even today. Nothing creates nationalism like somebody else's nationalism. So Albanian nationalism was starting quite rapidly to become a thing, as the kids say, during these years. And that led them to want to resist the Balkan allies and either remain under Ottoman rule or, as actually happened, to set up on their own as an independent Albanian state. Well, here we've got Serbian soldiers making a bivouac in Alessio or Leja in northwest Albania because, of course, the Serbs wanted to push right on through to the coast, even though they didn't actually manage that. And under these pressures, we have Ismail Kemali from the south, he's a Tosk, declaring Albanian independence at Vlora, which is a coastal city in the south, in 1912. And here he is with the North Albanian, well, Kosovar Albanian guerrilla leader Isa Boletini in 1912. Now, the outcome of the war is shown here on this map.
Okay, so each of the Balkan allies had expanded a lot, but it looks like Bulgaria more than any of them.
Yes, it had, and that was a big problem. There was disapproval from the outside world and more than disapproval from Bulgaria's allies in the First Balkan War, as we will see in a moment. But let's just quickly squeeze in here a picture of the front cover of Balkanski Rat, Balkan War, January 1913, a Belgrade publication celebrating Serbian King Petar as the conquering hero on, well, not a white horse, but on a horse at any rate. But yes, within a few weeks of the end of the First Balkan War, the Second Balkan War breaks out, with Bulgaria's erstwhile allies being joined by the Ottoman enemy in cutting a suddenly overmighty Bulgaria down to size.
Right, and this would have been understood by Bulgarians as betrayal by their former allies.
Yes, it would, and it leaves Bulgaria very angry as a revanchist state, which accounts for why, once World War I really gets going, in 1915, they come into the war on the side of the Habsburgs and Germany, because their real enemy is Serbia, who they feel has betrayed them in the Second Balkan War. Now, we can't say too much about this, the map speaks for us, but let's just spare a thought for the poor town of Kukush, which had been the birthplace of Gotse Delchev, one of the foremost VMRO leaders. In 1873, there had been more than 5,000 Bulgarians, Orthodox Slavs living there, 155 Muslims. I'm afraid I'm not informed as to whether those are Turks or whether they are Muslim Slavs, of whom there were and indeed are many, and 40 Romani or Gypsies. So overwhelmingly Slavic Orthodox town, like Gotze Delchev himself. But Greece drives the Slavs out. This is an illustration of the battle there. So the town had been captured in the First Balkan War by Bulgaria, but in the second, it's taken by Greece at the cost of 15,000 casualties between the two sides, so more people than actually lived in the town. And it's reduced to rubble, as you can see in this picture here, in the Battle of June 1913, and almost all of its population was expelled to Bulgaria. So we're seeing ethnic cleansing here by massacre and by expulsion. Although the other method that we can't talk about much here is simply by forcible assimilation, people being required to change their names and or the names of the places where they live. And the outcome of the war is a repartitioning of Macedonia, geographic Macedonia, I want to stress again here, by the victor powers. So the grey outline is historic or geographic Macedonia, and you can see that Greece holds the south, Serbia the north, and the smallest part, Pirin, Macedonia, is held there by Bulgaria.
Yeah, and this is not really very different to the territorial lines through Macedonia today. And Serbia insisted that North Macedonia was really historic South Serbia.
South Serbia, yes, or Old Serbia, just like Kosovo, and just like, as they maintained, North Albania, yes. So, and just to finish up on this here, we have the Balkans as it looked after the Second Balkan War. And for people who really want to read up on this stuff, this is a collection of essays by various authors. So, as is always the case with these kinds of volumes, the quality and the texture of the essays varies from one essay to another, but they're all pretty helpful, looking at the conflicts from multiple standpoints. For a slightly lighter read, Joyce Carey was an upper class Englishman, sick, yes, Joyce as a guy's name, and he served as a stretcher bearer during the Balkan Wars. And his book, Memoir of the Bobotes, is his eyewitness account of what he calls a forgotten war fought by peasants under primitive conditions. Okay, so just to finish off here briefly, we're going to mention how this all comes to a head in the assassination in Sarajevo, which, as we all learned in school, is the trigger which a few weeks later leads to the explosion of the First World War. So the whole region is a powder keg. We threatened at the beginning of this episode to mention the Black Hand again, and here they are. Ujedinjenje ili smrt, which literally means unity or death. And the oath made by their members was fearsome indeed.
This is the setup that Opus, Serbia's plotter in chief, led.
Right, this is his group. And the oath gives you the flavour of the group and tells us something about him, really. I, by entering into the society, do hereby swear by the sun which shineth upon me, by the earth which feedeth me, by God, by the blood of my forefathers, by my honour and by my life, that from this moment onward and until my death I shall faithfully serve the task of this organisation, and that I shall at all times be prepared to bear for it any sacrifice. I further swear to God by my honour and by my life that I shall unconditionally carry into effect all its orders and commands. I further swear by my God, by my honour and by my life that I shall keep within myself all the secrets of this organisation and carry them with me into my grave. May God and my brothers in this organisation be my judges if I at any time should wittingly fail or break this oath.
Oof.
Blood-curdling stuff. Well, this organisation is behind the assassination of this man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Emperor Franz Josef's nephew, and from 1889, heir presumptive.
Yeah, heir presumptive, but his great uncle Franz Josef didn't actually like him.
No, they didn't really like one another at all. And there are accounts after the assassination of Franz Josef actually being a little bit relieved that this guy was never going to be emperor. Right? But nevertheless, the assassination had immense consequences. Here is Franz Ferdinand with his wife Sophie Chotek, who was Czech, and their children. They were a devoted married couple. And here they are in Sarajevo on the day of the assassination, the 28th of June, 1914, Vidovdan, which was a key day in the Serbian calendar. So it was rather a provocative day to go paying a state visit to Sarajevo. Here we have a picture of him and his wife a few minutes before the assassination. And again here, same picture, different colorization. And moments before the fateful turning of their car. Here's a map of what happened, showing the route the Archduke's car was supposed to continue along the riverbank, but it turned right into a side street instead by mistake and then stalled right by where young Gavrilo Princip was making his way home. And here we have a picture of the spot, Schiller's Bakery, which was a delicatessen. It was on the corner where the shooting happened.
Now, that corner building looks pretty different today, and there's now a commemoration stone marking the spot.
Oh, there have been a variety of different monuments there over the years since. That's a story in itself. But alas, we are running out of time. But yeah, that's a spot where you and I have been together with a group of students. Here is the young guy, Gavrilo Princip, who did the fateful deed. This is perhaps the most famous photograph, though, but it's widely misunderstood. It's believed to be him being arrested immediately after the assassination, but it's not. It's a guy called Ferdinand Bear, who was a completely innocent bystander who was grabbed by mistake and was later released. But they did pick up Princip right after. And there was a backlash immediately afterwards. Crowds in Sarajevo, shown here, around trashed Serbian property. There was the murder of 2 Serbs and the destruction of 1,000 Serb-owned properties in the city. And here we've got a picture of looted and trashed Serb shops in Bashčašća, or at least the region of Bashčašća in central Sarajevo during that month, with angry Catholics and Muslims blaming Serbs as a whole, as people, of course, are wont to do to this day. If somebody from a particular community does some despicable act, people from outside it are likely to take it out on the whole community, and that was what happened here.
Right.
Well, this, of course, leads by various steps over the next few weeks to the outbreak of the First World War, but we're going to be looking at that and its aftermath in the next episode.
Yes, so we hope you enjoyed this one. And as usual, we're going to make a plea if you would repost it on social media and share with your friends so that we can spread the joy and the info and the book recommendations with some other people.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
So we'll be back next week to look at, as Mike said, the tragic course of World War I in this region, and then how that led to the birth of the first Yugoslavia.
Yes, and we'll be trying to follow through on that story as well. But as you can see, this has all been a little breathless, and I fear that the next episode might be as well, but we'll see what we can manage. Thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.